and then I'm going to present this. All right, so here we are. All right, let's just get this started then. All right, hello everybody. My name is Alexia Smalling, and I work with the Southwest ADA Center located in Houston, Texas. And this is the second part of our Roe versus Wade podcast. And here today, I have joining with me today, Diego Damaya, who has been working with the Southwest ADA Center for many years and is, in my opinion, very very knowledgeable of the ADA and how it applies in different topics. So I will have Diego just say a few words about himself, and then we will go right into the podcast.
Right. Thank you, Alexia. And so my name is Diego de Maya, and I am an attorney, and I work for the Southwest ADA Center. And I've been there for quite a few years, and I specialize in ADA law and some other subsets of that, like employment discrimination law, and labor law, and then privacy law, healthcare, and artificial intelligence, and some other types of areas where the ADA has non-discrimination requirements has an impact on those legal areas. And so that's kind of what I do. And I'm also the lead technical assistance provider for the Southwest ADA Center. And occasionally do training, educational trainings and group trainings, as well as write a few publications like legal bulletins or technical assistance pieces that we publish through our website. Okay.
All right. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for your introduction.
Yeah.
We will go to this next slide. So these are just some statistics that we shared last time in this podcast series about reproductive healthcare access. Last time, I kind of gave some background about why we are talking about this today in the first place. This past summer of the year 2022, there was a leaked draft opinion earlier this summer about how Roe versus Wade, which was a landmark decision to legalize abortion federally, was going to be overturned. And this was just a leaked draft decision. It was not official yet, but that leaked draft got a lot of people talking about what this means for them. And this is about different intersections of people. This is about people of color, people who are in impoverished areas or who are in underserved communities. And my focus in the podcast was people with disabilities. Already there are different healthcare barriers for people with disabilities. And I really wanted to kind of open up this podcast to explore what this means in the terms of reproductive healthcare access for people with disabilities. So the landmark decision was actually overturned in real life later on in the summer. And it got a lot of people talking. It took away a lot of rights for people, especially in Texas, where the governor made it so that abortion was completely illegal with no exceptions at all. And this is a lot of similar cases for different states that around the nation. Some states, they did decide to keep abortion legal, but many did not. And this affected a lot of people. So in the last podcast episode, I spoke about what this decision means in terms of for people with disabilities. But in this podcast episode, we are going to be going more into the legal aspects of this landmark decision of overturning Roe versus Wade, due to the case of Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which is what ultimately overturned this decision and took away rights for a lot of people. This decision also violates the notion of stare decisis. It kind of, stare decisis means that previous landmark decisions should not be overturned because it shakes up the legal foundation of the United States. So I talked about that. I talked about how this really does go against human rights and the right to decide and choose what to do for your own body, and also the potential future implications, such as trigger laws. And so I really wanted to enlist the help of an expert, in my opinion, of the ADA, and also this topic of my own interest about healthcare access in general. So I asked my colleague Diego de Maya to come in and talk with me about what this means. So, Diego, I have a few questions for you. And this is the third slide. It's labeled the ADA and reproductive health care. And this will be where we will stay for the rest of the podcast as we are going over our questions. So, Diego, my first question for you is, how did the initial ruling of Roe versus Wade attempt to include disability rights, if at all?
So I'm thinking that you mean the new case that overruled Roe versus Wade, right?
So actually,
Yeah.
in this question, I was talking about the first ruling of Roe versus Wade, which actually made abortion legal.
Right. The
I was
1970s
wondering,
decision.
yes.
Right.
So
Hmm.
yeah, we're going way, way back, and,
Right.
then we'll circle
Right.
back to what it means now.
Okay.
But how did
So,
that '70s ruling attempt to include disability rights?
well, basically I mean, the old decision, I don't, I don't seem to recall, not having read it in a long time.
Hmm.
I don't seem to recall that that it, went into disabilities, specifically, right? And
Hmm.
so it talked about, the privacy right of um, of women to have, their consultations with their doctor be private and confidential, and so the right to privacy and to make a decision about what to do with their bodies, or how to, or whether or not to terminate a pregnancy, if that's what's the case. And then so it dealt with those topics and subject matters, and so it basically said, that that they could not interfere with that right of, self-determination, and making a decision in either direction, whether to keep a pregnancy or to terminate a pregnancy. So that's kind of what it really dealt with, in addition to the whole privacy concept, which is kind of vague in the United States Constitution to begin with. You have to
Hmm.
like do a lot of interpreting to get to where to get to the point where you can say, yeah, there's a right to privacy, or as some might oppose and say, well, there's no right to privacy, which is, at least to me, in my understanding of of the law
Hmm.
and the rights of human beings in general, is that, there's always some kind of a right to privacy that everyone has. And then what people have to decide for themselves is, do they give consent, or do they give up that privacy when they engage in doing any particular type of activity, including seeing their doctor, making this medical decisions. And so that's why it was an important decision. And if you think about it from a more global standpoint, um, it would affect individuals with disabling conditions or significant disabilities. And because when I was in law school, one of the things that we talked about in during third year when you take advanced courses is, we talked about, for example, what happens when you have a parent who comes to a lawyer and says, I have an adult child with Down syndrome, and I don't want him to be having children, basically. And because we feel that, his genetic um, makeup might transfer those genes that caused the Down syndrome to begin with. And so, it's a valid reasoning, that those parents came with. And of course, the answer was no, you cannot take away the rights of anyone, including people with Down syndrome, or any other kind of significant mental or neurological type of, or even physical impairment for that matter, the right to procreate, basically, right?
Hmm.
And so the answer was no. You cannot, no judge would ever take away those rights, you know, unless, of course, is to save the life of the individual, right? Which, of course, Roe v. Wade dealt with, right?
Mm.
So, or at least addressed in part, but essentially, so disabilities, in a manner of speaking, did come into play, because it would have involved dealing with issues such as those that Roe v. Wade would have affected. So you could have someone with a significant medical complication where a pregnancy would need to be terminated. And so, in order to save that individual's life, and that would have been because that person might have, like, say, cerebral palsy or Down syndrome or whatever the complication would be that would have made a very difficult pregnancy, risk the life of the adult person. So it, I'm thinking that it really did have to deal with, it would necessarily have to imply or suggest that disabilities, would be covered in some way or another. And then, of
Hmm.
course, that will bring us to your next, the follow-up questions later, where we talk about the latest decisions and what's going on with reproductive health care and medicines and so forth.
Yes, so it's very interesting because even before the talk of this leaked draft opinion that ultimately overturned Roe versus Wade, it seemed that uh, how Roe versus Wade exactly was inclusive of people with disabilities. Uh, it was pretty vague, the language about it. And this is kind of highlighted in some case studies that I looked at, where I examined the case studies of a few women with disabilities who wished to have an abortion and they underwent the abortion. And the
Mhm.
experience did not go so well. They felt discriminated against. There were comments made by the doctor about how perhaps the termination was for the best and things like that. So which is not the best thing to say in the first place. Um, and also when it comes to accessing the abortion already, accessing the provider that would give the abortion already, it was very difficult to do because it seemed that people with disabilities had to go through different hurdles, finding an accessible clinic that may have been out of state, and then comes the question about traveling there in an airplane where uh, they can break the wheelchair, or they may not be the most accessible in
Sure.
general, or long car travels. So there was already many barriers already, even when this was a protected right for women.
And yeah, I know. And it's also interesting, Alexia, that you mentioned that. But going back to your comment about, like a doctor's opinion, when
Mhm,
someone is either trying to terminate a pregnancy because of a health issue or whatever other personal reason they might have, right? Because that's ultimately what Roe v. Wade was about. It was that
mhm,
women could make their own decisions and not necessarily report to anyone why they made such a decision. You
mhm.
know, there could have been a host of reasons: financial, economic, poverty,
Right.
lack of health care, disability. It could have been so many different things. Sexual assault, so on
Mhm,
and so forth, right?
mhm,
So that's what the decision was. So it was so important. But one thing that we should probably highlight and mention that is even today in 2022, in the 21st century, right? I think we're in the 21st century.
yeah.
Last time I checked.
Yes.
And even today, you still have healthcare providers like doctors who have a really strong opinion about individuals with disabilities. I guess we should say female with disabilities, right? Women
Mhm,
who are about to have a child or give birth. And they have these opinions that if you have a disability, particularly a significant disability or an obvious one, that maybe they should not be a parent because of their
mhm.
disability,
Right.
which of course, at least most advocacy groups across the country would say that's just ludicrous. That's just a ludicrous thing to even imagine that because somebody is blind or because they're deaf or because they're in a wheelchair that they can't have children. I mean, I've
Mhm.
met many professional women out there who are in a wheelchair and they had children while they're in a
Yeah.
wheelchair. I mean, the condition did not stop them from the the act of procreation, basically,
Right.
and it didn't make them any less a good parent than if they were physically fit, for that matter. And so, of course, that's the implication that healthcare, regrettably, I'm not going to say in general, like all of healthcare, right? Because obviously that's not everybody.
Mhm.
But there are certain individuals out there who provide healthcare who have these really strong opinions. And regrettably, that translates, from my standpoint as a lawyer who follows court decisions and what judges do and what they're thinking about on a given topic or issue. Regrettably, that kind of thinking, permeates down to even judges, when they're dealing with
Mhm.
custody cases in court, and they decide that because somebody is a quadriplegic, oh well, they should not be
Mhm.
awarded custody of their children. Basically, it would go to the spouse who is not physically impaired, and regrettably, that has a lot more to do with fighting, two couples who are divorcing, basically, I'm sorry, two individuals who are divorcing each other, and fighting for custody, rather than, the physical disability essentially should not be an issue at all. In other words, the judge should be completely blind to anything relating to healthcare or the person's disability. So I just kind of wanted to emphasize that even today, that that
Mhm.
still continues to permeate across,
Yeah, no, and
yeah,
that's another thing I found in my research. It's very interesting because if you look at, it's like there's many like logical fallacies in the arguments for, pro life and
right,
banning abortions. Uh,
yeah,
a lot of these groups are saying that, oh, because I am pro life, because I do not wish you to terminate a pregnancy because the child might have a disability, I'm also pro disability rights. But there's a
sure,
lot of things that go into that, because when you're talking about parents who eventually who have disabilities, who eventually want to become parents, they do face a lot of these legal battles. They can have their children taken away from them as well in extreme
hmm,
cases, because of the image that people have of people with disabilities not being fit parents for those who do wish to be parents. So it really does contradict itself, these barriers to having reproductive health care access for everybody. It does contradict itself a lot.
right.
Well, as we're talking about this, before this was overturned, I do want to get into, now that it is overturned, what is everything looking like right now? How has this current overturning of this landmark decision started to affect individuals with disabilities? And you can give examples of things you've read in the news, or even calls you may have received. You can make it very general, any like particular cases. But I really do want to know, how has this decision started to affect people with disabilities, this new decision?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking of a metaphor, which is, an avalanche. When you have a snow
Mhm.
avalanche, it begins right, like kind of flat, and then it gets bigger, and then it becomes
Mhm.
bigger and
Yes.
bigger as it keeps going down the hill.
Yeah.
And I think that we've had an avalanche effect, an escalation effect, basically.
Oh, yes.
For those who might think of it that way, maybe, where it seems like one thing ends up leading into the other, and then things just get worse and more
Mhm.
worse, if you can even say it that way, and then better worse. But basically, it has affected. I think that we have to look at the world of disabilities in general, in that when we look at it from a healthcare standpoint, in the myriad of medications that people take for their disabilities, um, or significant medical conditions like, multiple sclerosis, or any, cancer treatment, anyone who has any condition like that. Many people, it's worth pointing out, don't consider themselves as having a quote unquote disability, even though they have gone through cancer, or they're dealing with it, or they have MS, or they have lupus, or
Mhm.
some other medical condition that is permanent or indefinite. And so but it has affected them in terms of this. This decision basically has come down to where you can look at a particular medication, and we live in an environment where medications, science, the beauty of science is that it can take something that was invented for one purpose, and then somebody comes along and says, oh, wow, we can use this for this other purpose as well,
Mhm.
you know, and then you get experiments from there that branch out into some other area. And this is what happens with medicine all the time, right?
Right. Right.
There's all kinds of medications out there, which we're not going to get into because I cannot even pronounce the names of
Yes.
medications, let
Uh,
alone remember what they do. But, needless to say that, for example, there's medication that people take for seizure disorder that
mhm.
has been used to relieve people with extreme back pain, for example, when they have a dislocated disc or something like that, where the pain is so excruciating that you just cry all day long in pain and you can't move. Well, there's medications that might be used for seizure disorder that are used for pain control. So that's just a
Right.
really simple example. And so there are medications out there that are used for that are used by people with disabilities for their condition, whatever it might be. Again, we're not going to get into details because that would involve, you'd have you'd have to bring another expert into this, to explain what medications do.
Mhm.
But basically, you have people using medications where those medications might also be used for a termination of a pregnancy, or
Right.
in some other way, not just terminations, but also in some other way to treat a pregnancy medical condition that relates to pregnancy, or
Mhm.
that might affect it in some way, or to even help women have, give birth, or
Mhm.
become more fertile. So um, it affects all of that because now you have the association of those medications to quote unquote abortions or quote unquote pregnancy terminations. And all of a sudden you're going, wait a minute, so you're going to deny me this medication that I need for my disability,
Right.
for my medical issue. Let's say like it might be something like any condition. I don't want to pick on any particular type of condition.
Mhm.
um, and the pharmacist, because the state of Texas, for example, passed a law that says that pharmacists can decline to provide any medication without giving any reason at all. Because of that, they might decide, you know what, this is used for reproductive medicine, so I can't prescribe this medication. You'll have to go find somebody else to get the medication. And that is actually happening as we speak. We're getting calls about this at the ADA
Mhm.
centers,
Mhm.
where we have to explain how the ADA applies, how Section 504 applies, and how the Affordable Care Act also applies to prevent that kind of discrimination, to the extent that the pharmacist, despite there being a law that protects him or her from, you know, some kind of liability if they say no, I don't want to provide this medication, you know, because they have a religious objection or some other personal objection, like say to a pregnancy termination, um, they decide not to dispense the medication when federal law says you have to. You can't discriminate on the person's
Mhm.
on the basis of race, gender, right? A pregnancy status, which is sex discrimination,
Mhm.
and or disability for that matter. So it really has affected these areas by
Mhm.
creating an entirely new host of complications and problems that um, most people out there are not going to be able to resolve that easily. Because
Mhm.
think of living in a small town and you have one pharmacy, and
Right.
all of a sudden the head pharmacist says, I'm not going to dispense that medication, and they even stop ordering it. Now
Mm.
what do you do? Do you end up going to the emergency room? Does that
Mhm.
mean that people on Medicare or Medicaid now have to use more of those benefits, which are, based on our tax base, to
Mhm.
basically to go to a emergency room, which is going to cost 10 times, what they would have paid to see a doctor to get the medication prescribed. There's all kinds of problems like that.
Wow. That you bring up a really good point. This affects everybody now, this new ruling. It doesn't just
Yes.
affect people seeking, this form of reproductive health care. It affects everyone who,
Even people without disabilities.
even people
Exactly.
without, yes,
Who might
exactly,
need a medication, you know,
exactly,
and
because of
all
the
of a sudden,
medication.
right, all of a sudden they're told you can't get this medication, not from this pharmacy or
Right.
from this, or prescribed by this, doctor, for example, who decides not to do it based on some of these state laws.
So, okay, I have a question for you.
Mhm.
So, if a pharmacy can deny this, uh, so the law says the pharmacy can deny any medication without giving a reason, but there is the ADA in 504 that says you can't discriminate against disability. How is that allowed to happen at all? What would you suggest to people who have a call about this particular case? Well, not suggest, but what would you be able to say about how the law applies in this case?
Well, I have to say that because the podcast will probably be heard by many people in
Hmm.
different situations, right?
Right.
We hope, that we promote it and that people will listen to it to become more informed.
Hmm.
And that I have to explain that first, of course, you do have the ADA, Section 504, and the Affordable Care Act that prohibit um, denying someone a benefit or a service or a good or a service. And, medication would be considered a good that you sell in the stream of commerce, right?
Hmm.
This is one of the things that I always emphasize when we're doing trainings that relate to um, the sale of goods and services or education services from a private standpoint, from private businesses like pharmacies, which are private corporations.
Hmm.
um, Basically, the many people forget that if something is in the quote unquote stream of commerce, right, that means that it's being sold in the markets across the United States,
Hmm.
then that means that that business cannot generally discriminate on the basis of all the protected categories like race, gender, and disability. So, um, so for that reason, um, this this gets complicated because people read about these state legislatures that are passing these laws, which are basically giving someone the privilege or authority to basically decline to provide something based on some kind of personal objection, right? And we can, we'll dispense with discussing what that personal objection could be. It could be many different things.
Hmm.
But to save time, we'll say that the law just basically protects them and says you don't have to give any reason, like the Texas law apparently does in regards to pharmacists, right? You don't have to give any reason at all. Just say, I'm not providing it, go get it someplace else. And um, okay, so basically the problem, the conflict is that we hope that these pharmacies and pharmacists who are, by the way, licensed by a state pharmacy board, right?
Hmm.
These are healthcare professionals, which go through a rigorous career training. They spend a lot of time in school and graduate school to get their degrees and certifications, right? They are, they're held to a really high standard. And so when they do their work, they have to do it in compliance with all applicable laws, which include federal law, such as HIPAA, the privacy protection law that prevents doctors, nurses, employers, anybody from disclosing basically protected health information, PHI. And so what
Hmm.
that means is that um, the pharmacist who is dispensing, let's say, some kind of medication which can be used for gender affirmation,
Right.
which was prescribed by a doctor, right, to their family, to the family of a juvenile, let's say, for example, okay, someone who's underage, um, and they decide not to provide that. Well, they'll be violating the ADA 504 and the ACA because they can't discriminate on the basis of that gender discrimination or gender status.
Mhm.
And even if there's no disability, they just can't discriminate. It's sex-based gender discrimination. If they happen to have a condition like gender dysphoria, which is which is a medical condition. It's I believe it's like an emotional disorder or psychiatric disorder. It falls into that category. Then they violate the ADA in Section 504, as well as the ACA for discrimination based on disability. And the problem is, people might say, well, how do we reconcile the fact that the state law lets them behave the way they want to behave, or decline the medication or the medical treatment for that matter, because this could be a doctor providing treatment. Um, does it allow them, to do that when federal law says they cannot do that? They cannot decline services or the medication. Well, that's the problem. That state legislatures are not even
Mhm.
going there. They're not
Right.
touching it at all. They're staying completely silent. They're saying, sure, you can decline the medication if you want to because you're a pharmacist. You have that right, by golly.
Right.
But what they're forgetting is that neither the state legislature, nor the governor, nor the state's attorney general will come to their defense when they get sued by the federal government for lack of
Mm.
compliance with the three laws that we just mentioned, the
Right.
ADA, 504, and the ACA,
Mhm.
as well as HIPAA.
Mhm.
And by the way, HIPAA can carry penalties all the way up to criminal prosecution,
Right.
means, which means either misdemeanor charges or even felony, which could also mean imprisonment.
Right.
And we know, obviously, we're talking about really egregious cases there, but the point being that nobody's going to come to their defense unless they hire their own attorney, which will no doubt cost them a great deal of money,
Mhm.
because you don't find that many attorneys that will defend a pharmacist who has violated federal law, basically, literally violated federal law. We're not talking about a vague violation that's debatable, or where we debate that, does the law really apply? There's no such argument. It's a
Mhm.
literal black
Right.
and white statutory violation. So
Right.
that's your huge problem right there, is that people who want to enforce the state rights, or they want to be under that umbrella and say, gee, I don't have to provide this because of my personal objection. Well, I think that's wonderful when you think about it in your private life. You don't have to support any cause in your private life. But when you work as a doctor or a pharmacist in this case, that changes completely. Now you have all these laws that you're subject to.
Wow.
And there you have
Wow.
it.
Wow. So,
So the
that's
state is not going to
yeah.
come to the defense. I mean, I think that's the bottom
Mhm.
line. They need to be. We're hoping that, you and I, Alexia, are informing them that
Right.
if you want to do
Exactly.
this, please understand that, the state will not come to your defense.
Wow. That's very helpful information for anybody who's searching for this. Because I'm sure a lot of
Mhm.
people have been bringing questions to the TA line about what this means for them. So, I'm really glad
Yeah.
that you were able to give that bit of information. Speaking of
Yeah.
information, you did help put together a whole legal bulletin document,
Mhm.
kind of talking about this subject along with gender affirming procedures, as you have mentioned. So can you give a few highlights of this document? And I know it's still a work in progress, but when it
Oh, it's
is
been published. Yeah, it's been published. But
right, okay,
yeah.
okay,
Uh-huh.
great. So
Yeah.
maybe you can talk
Mhm.
more about what the highlights of this document are and where
Yeah.
people can find it, as it's a really good source of reference for this topic that we're talking about today.
Yeah, no, I think that anybody who listens to your podcast previously, the one you did prior to this one,
Hmm.
as well as this one, maybe they really ought to go to southwestada.org
Hmm.
and, look for the publication that, the latest legal e-bulletin. It'll be prominently shown there, if they go to the main website. It might even be under what's new, but the point being that they can read all about the two main federal health and human services federal agency notices, enforcement notices is what they're called, basically.
Okay.
If it's essentially telling the states and telling pharmacists and medical providers and healthcare providers across the board that if they violate any of these laws, the ADA, the 504, and the ACA, as well as HIPAA, if they violate these laws, they will be investigated. And if they find cause, they will be prosecuted or they will be fined,
Hmm.
for their violation. So that's basically what I wrote about. I
Okay.
clarified what these notices meant. There's two notices. One deals with the sale of medications that might be in some way or another be used in reproductive medicine,
Hmm.
whether they were intended for as reproductive medicine or intended for other medical uses, like we just talked about. It talks about that. And then the other notice deals with gender affirming medical treatment. And so there's two separate enforcement notices from the HHS that people should really take a look at to understand that these types of services provided by healthcare providers, including pharmacists and doctors, are essentially that they are prohibited from discriminating on the basis of disability, of course, as well as the other protected categories like gender and sexual orientation. So that's
Okay.
pretty much in a nutshell what we wrote about. And of course, we do talk about how the ADA applies,
Hmm.
both Titles 3 and Title 2 of the ADA. Title 3 as it applies to private businesses like a pharmacy, and then Title 2 as it applies to like a local county hospital, which of course, might have pharmacies inside the hospital. So a lot of people who are poor and have no health care, they'll get their medications through pharmacies that are supported by, the state, as well as the federal government through the local, public hospitals. So that's important to mention as well. So that's basically what it's about, without going into too much detail. Basically, you and I have been discussing a lot of what's talked about in this legal bulletin that just got published by the Southwest ADA Center.
Okay. Yeah. So this resource will be really good for people who kind of want to see a written, case, not case by case basis, but general information about, how they can apply this to any situation that they are in.
Right, right. And we
Okay.
also talk about, yeah, and we also talk about, of course, in the publication, we give the legal citations
Okay.
that somebody with who wants much more detail that they could get for that from our legal bulletin. And then we also do talk about the fact that, a state is not going to come running to protect anybody
Right. Okay.
who engages in the illegal activity, per the federal compliance laws.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
That's great. That's great.
Mhm.
That's really great information. So I'm sure people are also wondering what else they can access at this moment. So, at the present moment, what are some resources that people with disabilities can use for help in accessing reproductive health care access and information? We went over information, but what about
Yeah.
the access part?
Yeah. So basically, I mean, if I understand your question, basically, people have to continue doing things the way they have been, which is seeing their private doctors or finding
Hmm.
a doctor to go talk to when it concerns anything from medical conditions to disability to actual pregnancy or termination of a pregnancy or using
Right.
medications that might be related to reproductive health care. And so that's the law doesn't change who they get to go to or who they see or who they talk to. Essentially, they have to keep doing things the way they have been. I think
Okay.
that I think that it might be worth noting that since the decision came out, reversing Roe versus Wade or
Hmm.
basically ending that case, um, that obviously reproductive healthcare related clinics or healthcare providers who deal in that area are becoming less and less available.
Right.
A lot of clinics have essentially shut down
Hmm.
because of the fear of being sued by either private citizens who have been given the right to do so under state laws, such as Texas.
Yes.
And, I hate to be picking on Texas. There's all the
I
states, like
mean,
you said, yeah, you
it's
know,
pretty
but
bad.
I mean, you and I live in Texas, but
Right,
there's other
exactly.
states that have done the same things,
Hmm.
passed the same types of laws, regrettably, without
Yes.
considering the fairness or unfairness, as the case may be, of such laws. And so um, some of the necessary healthcare that people might need may not be available. Like the issue of a doctor prescribing a medication for a disability related disorder or medical condition, for example, that just so happens that medication is also used for reproductive health care. Well, if the doctor decides not to provide it, who are you going to go to? That's no longer available to you now because
Right.
that doctor decided not to do it. And whether or not you sue your doctor for that, that's entirely a personal decision, right?
Right.
But it doesn't stop any citizen from going to the HHS website
Mm-hmm.
and clicking on the how to file a complaint section. It's ready to go. On these
Right. Right.
websites, whether you go to the Department of Justice, ada.gov, or whether you go to hhs.gov, you will have the chance to file a complaint against a doctor or a pharmacy, and
Mm-hmm.
you don't have to sue them. You don't have to go find an attorney to do that. You can just file a complaint, and what happens is eventually the federal agency will see enough complaints brought against someone
Mm-hmm.
or a particular entity and act on it. And I have
Okay.
to tell you that, or share with our audience that, from our experience, there's no way to know how the federal enforcement agencies pick their cases. They pick their battles, obviously. They don't have enough people to take, to go up against everybody because, they won't do that. But who's to say that if you're a medical provider, a healthcare provider, a hospital or a private practice, who's to say that they're not going to come knocking on your door and saying, "Hey, we just got these complaints, and we're here to
Right.
talk to you about it." So, I personally, I wouldn't want to be faced with that kind of situation because once
Mhm.
the feds come to your doorstep, basically all bets are off. They get to look at your files, they get to look at your client lists, they get to look at your reports and activities, and where they might have been reported on one violation, all of a sudden they'll find multiple because they get to
Mhm.
go through the files. And that's something that I always warn, businesses and healthcare providers about, that it's not going to be just about the one complaint. So,
Right. Right. It
yeah,
only takes one. It only takes one.
right,
All
right.
right. That's very, very useful information for people who are, inquiring about that. So I did have a follow-up question to
Hmm.
that. So say that people want to use their resources when they want to inquire about where they can access reproductive health care in any form, whether that is obtaining medication or actually going through the medical procedure of a termination in general. Is the doctor allowed to direct them to a place where they are able to receive that service? So, say a doctor in Texas is asked this question: are they allowed under the law to direct them? Because I have been hearing different things about a doctor can be sued for even referring or not. So, how does that look for a doctor who wants to give out that information?
Right. So basically, this is the problem that this Supreme Court decision, one of the problems that it has created.
Mhm.
It has created a huge problem and conflict of interest, or legal conflicts, let's call it that,
Mhm.
between state laws and federal laws, and as well as the licensure obligations, the ethical and professional obligations of a doctor or a pharmacist who basically decides, let's say that they want to help someone and they say, look, I cannot give you these services, maybe because they don't practice in that area, right?
Mhm.
Or maybe because they don't have expertise or whatever. A legitimate reason. They say, look, let me refer you to this other provider who should be able to help you, right? And now you have a state law that comes in and says, no, you may not do that if it goes against the reproductive healthcare interest that we're promoting through our state law, which is basically, anti-abortion or anti-pregnancy terminations, and basically, pro-life. Um, in other words, it goes against that. And now the doctor has a dilemma.
Mhm.
Worse than a dilemma, it's not just a decisional dilemma. If it were just a decision dilemma, that would be simple, that would be easy, right? but it's not. Now it's a legal problem because if they give that referral, they might be violating state law. And yeah, like you said, there is a law that would allow citizens to sue them, right?
Mhm.
But again, I want to remind people again that what does that really mean? It allows a citizen to file a lawsuit. Okay,
Mhm.
I want to point out that before anybody in this country can file a lawsuit, what do you have to do? You got to get an attorney to do that.
Ah,
Not
right.
only do you have to get an attorney to do that, I mean, yeah, you could file a pro se uh, lawsuit in court against somebody, but let me just say that filing pro se lawsuits under these kinds of state laws are really complex. They're very procedural. You have to follow the court mandates, which have to do with providing notices to the person you're suing, let's say a doctor,
Mhm.
right? You have to provide them with all these notices and you have to provide them with serve them with the complaint. So now you have to these are all expenses, by the way. This is all costing money, lots of money. We're not talking about 20, $30. We're talking about thousands of dollars in fees involving to serve people their court notices. Then you have to meet those calendar dates and provide the court briefings. You have to provide the briefs. You have to provide the petition to the court. And then the court has to review that. Then by that time, let's say multiple months have gone by, right?
Mhm.
Now the other party has to get an attorney to defend themselves for having made a decision to make a referral. Now the person who's suing is going to have to show up in court and prosecute the case. And I don't know about you, Alexia, but how many people do you know would be able to prosecute a case without having experience to do so?
Not many.
Yeah, I mean, we all watch TV. We
Right.
watch, NCIS or
Yes.
whatever, and some of these courtroom dramas, which are great,
Right.
and you go,
Right.
hey, I can do that. That's
Right.
great. Except that they forget the part where you had to have the knowledge to know how
Right.
to litigate a case in court. The Lincoln lawyer comes to mind. Everybody's a
Right.
Lincoln lawyer, and I'm like,
Exactly.
yeah, sure you are. And, so it's regrettable that state legislatures will pass these laws without really explaining to people just how complicated the whole matter can get and how expensive it will be.
Mhm.
And so by the time one of these lawsuits might even get to court, right? The other side, which is typically a doctor or a pharmacist or a corporation, guess what? They have attorneys. That
Mhm.
attorney would have been responding all the way through and through and basically showing the judge how the case should be dismissed or how it should be disposed of on summary judgment, which will include collecting legal fees from the other party who filed the lawsuit. So notice how complicated this whole thing got. And regrettably, the
Right.
legislators, the governor, the attorney general, it's funny how none of them discuss any of this
Right.
with their constituencies who they claim to be supporting. They say they're acting on behalf of the people who vote in the state, right?
Mhm.
Um, and let's be realistic, they're talking about people who belong to their party. And
Right.
so, regrettably, they're not informing their people. They're doing a disservice to their own party. They're doing a disservice to the citizens that vote for them by failing to explain the complexities and the expense involved and the dangers of being sued, for example, for those legal costs that the other person was forced to incur, which could end up being in the hundreds of thousands. And
Right.
you're going, oh, wow, wait a minute. Do I really want to sue this doctor for having referred a patient to another doctor who can provide either pregnancy termination services or reproductive services, whatever they might be? Because remember, this is supposed to be private,
Mhm.
right? HIPAA prohibits anybody from reporting anybody with regards to their private medical information. So
Mm.
remember what we
Okay.
talked about, how even though the state law might allow a pharmacist to say to not explain why they're declining to dispense a medication,
Mhm.
well, that's fine. They're welcome to do that and not dispense the medication. And the law might even allow them, like Texas law does, to report that individual. to say like a health authority, like the state of Texas Health and Human Services Department, right?
Right.
Which I presume is the mechanism, since that's not clearly explained either
Right.
in the state legislation.
Hmm.
Do you report it to the Attorney General? Do you report it to the Health and Human Services? Who do you report it to? And what mechanism is there? Is there a link on the website that says report parents of gender changing? I mean, how do they list that on the? I'd love to see that.
Right.
How do they even list it? How
Right.
do you find it? But anyway, my point being that this gets extremely complicated, and regrettably, the state legislatures and the governor and the attorney general are in all these states, not just Texas, are doing a pitiful job, if doing any job at all, of
Hmm.
informing citizens what these laws mean and how you go about enforcing them. The complexity of it.
Right,
So,
right. Yeah, this has created definitely a big old mess, just to
yep.
put it
Yes.
colloquially. But hopefully, with self-education, citizen self-education,
Like listening to the podcast, right?
and yes, listening to
Yeah.
the podcast, going
Yeah.
out and voting, changing up the
Hmm.
who is in power and who is very, progressive and, keeps human rights in mind,
Yeah.
and science and education and all of that stuff in mind, then, hopefully we can change the script for us.
I think
So
so. And maintaining the privacy, that people have a right to that kind of privacy when it comes to their medical decisions and who they
right.
talk to about it, whether it's their own family, their spouse, their significant other, their partner, whatever the case may be, that, they have a right to privacy in this country. People cannot just go around reporting each other, because that would just create such a messy state of things, that
Right.
we start reporting each other on anything we see that we don't like or dislike. It's one thing when you're witnessing a crime
Hmm.
and you call 911 and report the crime, you know, but it's another thing to just report someone. You're sitting in a medical waiting room, right? It could be so simple. Sitting in a medical room for your turn to see the doctor, and you hear a conversation, and you pick up the phone, or you go to the website with your phone and you report it to the attorney general because you heard that they're going to be talking about gender affirming medication with the
Hmm.
doctor, with their private doctor. And you're sitting there going, oh my gosh, you know what? We're hoping that all this information that you and I are providing, will make them think twice and
Hmm.
really make them realize that, what if their right to privacy were violated this way?
Right.
How would they feel if somebody were to report that they're going to see their doctor because they're going to go and discuss um, getting a vasectomy, or they're going to go talk about um, uh, um, what do you call it? Birth control pills, or
Hmm.
they're going to talk about uh, taking a hormone that they might need for some other healthcare issue. How would they feel if somebody sitting in that room were to report them to an
Right.
authority? you
Right.
know we're hoping that this information will help hopefully remind people, even anyone, whether you support you know termination of pregnancies or you don't support it at all, whether you're a pro-life or you promote abortions or you don't, or you just believe in the right to privacy and people can make their own decisions on that. We're hoping that this will convince them that you can't just pick up the phone and report someone, that that's just not the way life works, at least not in this country, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah,
Well, thank you for, giving all this really helpful information, and having this, very insightful discussion with me as we talk about these kind of hot button topics, that have been
sure.
hotly debated this summer. So I have this slide here. It says, thank you, and to please contact the Southwest ADA Center for any ADA 504 related questions or more. And this applies to if you are a person with a disability, or if you are, as Diego mentioned, a business, educational entity, or corporation. Please call us at this number 1-800-949-4232, or at this email swdbtac at ilru.org. And I have this here in the slide, so please contact us for anything else. And again, Diego, thank you so much for coming on to this podcast and giving your insight about how these things. I learned a lot of things from you, in this session. So I just want to thank you again. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you for having me on the program.
Of course, of course. Okay, so I'm going to